Thank you. So, hello everyone. To briefly introduce, I'm a first year PhD student at the Nodive Research Group, the University of Trento, Italy. And this work, stratified data integration, was done in collaboration with my supervisor, Professor Fausto Junquilla, and my PhD colleagues Alessio and Simone, who are technical experts on this work. So in this presentation, I will be starting with the motivation behind this work. After which I will proceed to how we stratify and represent diversity, and finally I will be providing an overview of how we process diversity and glimpses of its more qualitative evaluation. So the motivation for stratifying representations that comes from a well-established conceptual framework in library and information science, which is named FRBR, Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, and and uh, and which stratifies representation into four layers, which is a work, expression, manifestation, and item. So, I mean, analogously, we also stratify representation, of course, taking motivation from that framework. We also stratify, representation into four layers: concept, language, knowledge, and data. And this stratification of representation also multiplies the phenomena of semantic heterogeneity due to the many-to-many mappings between each of these layers, between as well as within each of these layers, and this is rooted in the diversity that we observe around our world in terms of geographies, cultures, languages, etc. And and this combinatorial effect of semantic heterogeneity across these four layers leads to impediment in data integration, especially when we consider scenarios like, I mean, wherein heterogeneous data sources and standards are involved, where multiple languages and even multiple geographies might be involved. So, such a combinatorial effect led us to stratify the semantic heterogeneity across the four layers, as we saw. So, namely conceptual diversity, which we call as L1, language diversity L2, knowledge diversity, which we call as L4, and data diversity, which we call as L5. And we term this stratified organization of heterogeneity as representation diversity. So we take the motivating example on the right hand side of the screen, where we can see three representative data sets from the automobile domain. So one is car, second is Ventura, and third is vehicle, which essentially refers to the same real world entity, which is namely a car with this particular nameplate number FP372NK. So if we notice carefully, we can see the diversity, these four types of diversities existent within this representative example. So firstly, we can see the conceptual diversity when the same real world object is mentioned in the two data sets as, car, whereas in the third data set it's like a vehicle, which is a more general concept than car. So and we further see that it is described using three different lexicons. So namely a natural language in the second data set, which is Italian, and the other two data sets, these are encoded using namespaces, which are like from the schema.org, auto extension of schema.org, and for the third, which is the vehicle sales ontology. So these contributes again to the language diversity due to polysemy and synonym phenomena. And for knowledge diversity, we see that this object is described using different properties, some of them which might overlap between these data sets, but that essentially likely because due to the different focus of the databases in which these data sets might be resident. And finally, for data diversity, I mean, we see that the same real world object is described in a way that even when associated with the same properties, the corresponding values might be different. And this again occurs due to different units of measures, etc., different standards. So, the advantages of this approach are that each layer models a different type of phenomena, and correspondingly the type of diversity which occurs in that phenomena, and that the diversity which appears in a particular layer is independent of how it appears in the other layers, and then within each layer it's possible to utilize the established techniques and methods, and based on this stratification of and stratified approach of representation diversity, we designed a representation diversity architecture which allows to integrate any number of data sets from any domain. Of course, these data sets again requires pre-processing, and we do the integration by this following architecture, the sort of cyclic architecture. So first, semantically aligning the concepts present in the data sets to the unique IDs of the scene sets, which are present in our multilingual lexical semantic resource, which is named as the UKC, and or we call it as Universal Knowledge Core, which we heavily exploit in this architecture as background knowledge. So using this first block in the mechanism in this first block, we can integrate any number of natural languages, domain languages, and namespaces. And further, this also facilitates resolution of lexical gaps, which can often be, impediments in multilingual data integration. So this L2 block also enforces the input and output dependence of representation of data. So the L2 input language is translated into the L1 internal language in this subsequent block, of course, but since we use the conceptual core of the UKC, we have the IDs here. And the input language is resumed in the last step when the entity graph, which is the knowledge graph, is presented. And in that way, we can say that the language is actually the key enabler in this bidirectional interaction between the users and the platform, the architecture. So moving on from L2 to L1, we now organize this type of a-linguistic concepts expressed using IDs into a language entity graph, which hierarchically codifies the semantic relations across these concepts, and of course, therefore, among the input words also. And to achieve this, again, we exploit the conceptual core, the language independent concept core of this UKC resource. And from L1 to L4, we now model the entity type graph by distinguishing this LEG concepts into E-types, entity types, and properties, and organizing them into a subsumption hierarchy, which is fully aligned with the hierarchy as encoded in this L1, that is LEG. For example, the object the object with the plate number, as it was mentioned, can be encoded to be an entity of the of the entity type car and not of the entity type organism or facility or something else, thanks to this alignment between the hierarchies. And next we moving on from L4 to L5, we iteratively populate the ETG with data to form the entity graph, which is a knowledge graph. So this graph is constituted, the backbone is of L1 IDs, and each annotated with the input L2 terms. And also for each L2 term, this architecture of the system remembers the data set from where it comes, because we record the provenance also. And finally, it is presented to the user in any language, I mean in his or her preferred language. And okay, so this figure, this pipeline or this figure describes at a very high level the semi-automated process used to manage and integrate the diversity, as it was shown in the previous RTA slides. So it is highly flexible in the sense that it is independent of the input data or the domain from which the data comes from, and it's the intended target users are data integration teams comprising of data scientists, knowledge engineers, and domain experts with an understanding of the domain and the data integration problem that can be solved in this using this. So firstly, in this LEG construction, words and multi-words are extracted from the input data sets, and word sense disambiguation is performed on them, of course with the help of UKC concept code, to produce an integrated L1 and L2 representation of the input data. Yeah, of course, this activity uses our own in-house tool, multilingual NLP component Sprawl, which is again highly integrated with this UKC background knowledge. And the output of this phase, as it's shown, is a spreadsheet codifying the LEG, language entity graph. So next, the entity ETG construction takes in input the schemas of the input data sets, where the words are now annotated with the LEG concepts, and it constructs the entity type graph, which integrates them. And also, also after the integration, it is aligned with a reference ontology, like for example, schema.org, like that. And this particular phase or activity is performed via knowledge editor, which is similar in to Protege, but of course, which is highly integrated in the pipeline, in the UKC pipeline. And the output of this phase is an OWL file codifying the entity type graph, and of course also, using the language entity graph IDs and the L1 IDs. And okay, so next is the entity graph construction, which takes the ETG and the input data sets and constructs a mapping between the data values within each data sets and the entity type graph, which is built in the previous step. And this construction, this entity graph construction is an iterative activity which considers one data set at the time. And this is implemented, the mapping operations are implemented using a specific tool, which is called Karma Linker, which is actually our own adoption of the Karma data integration tool, highly integrated in the UKC pipeline with NLP features. And the output is an entity graph encoding the information in the initial data sets, and finally the entity graph is presented to the user for visualization and querying purposes. So this architecture and the pipeline is currently incubating in our lab, and we teach it to the the students of this master degree data science course on knowledge and data integration, where a, a 4 or 5 student group has to generate a domain specific knowledge graph. So as we can see, the heat maps for this 2018 and 19 indicate that we are making progress in every succession of KDI to refine our approach and making it as easy, efficient, and innovative as possible. And also, using our questionnaire, we have also recorded the response of the students, and they have also appreciated the use of the UKC in absorbing L1, L2, and L4 representation diversity. And also should note here that this approach has also been successfully employed in large-scale European Union projects, which our group partners in, especially in the medical domain. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening.